So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Star Wars. So let's start the series. Get down. The second headmaster commanded, leaping over the little Padawan, his lightsaber flashing midnight blue as it burned through the creature's throat. Padawan Itama smacked the ground and rolled just in time to escape being beheaded by another of the miserable monsters, while he fired another 3 with his lightsaber. Then the second headmaster reached for the thing with the force. Even more disturbing was the fact that they all felt like the cloying tar of darkness, and that attempts to employ ordinary telekinesis or mind tricks tended to slide away like oil separating from water, even though it was almost impossible to acquire a strong grip on any of them in the force. No clones could possibly have the same signature. It was simply not possible. The several dozen creatures that were swarming the settlement streets all had the same force signature, and although their identical white-green appearance surely inspired thoughts of amoral cloning and genetic experiments between some vicious plant life and a humanoid species. But it was obviously happening, and it meant the second headmaster was missing something. The secondary force threat caught the team's assailant, the opponents of second headmaster, and all creatures within a 30-meter radius, slamming them together like trash into a black hole. Taking advantage of their shock position, the second headmaster quickly used augmented attacks to decapitate them, before turning to confront the steps that were approaching. "Master!" Itama exclaimed suddenly. Itama trotted ahead to meet his GD master, absently shaking sand from his tunics. As the fairly little, red-haired man reached up and briefly laid a steady hand on the boy's dual-colored hair, he seemed to be greatly relieved. The second headmaster said, "Knight Akana," and nodded. "Knight second headmaster," the telekinetic replied quietly, his gray-brown eyes drifting back to examine his Padawan. Since the pair had been separated for over an hour when the most recent resurgence began, they were all lucky that the man's lips tipped down somewhat at the numerous wounds. In general, fighting inside a civilian city was riskier for both GD and non-combatants, due to the small streets, odd layouts, and many places for enemies to hide or plan ambushes, but it wasn't the worst battlefield for a Padawan like Itama, who wasn't being trained to specialize in fighting. Not to mention the potential for attacks through walls or, more terrifyingly, buildings being dropped on your head due to broken construction. However, Selk's wide streets with few lanes and block-long, reinforced buildings made it harder for the creatures to approach unobserved or corner them. "Where have you been, Master Sandman?" Itama asked, glancing uncomfortably at the floating bodies. Akana's left hand moved slightly, dropping the remains of the animals to the ground. "I was delayed by a larger force that appeared from the ground in the northwest quadrant," he said, drawing the second headmaster's attention. He then proceeded northeast into the core area, accompanied by a Padawan. "Once you relayed that you were accompanied by another group of GD, I recruited further support and ensured they were aware of the situation we face here," he said. "However," the second headmaster added, closing his eyes swiftly to confirm that the only active confrontations in the force were currently taking place in other districts. "When you say appeared, did they surface from the ground itself or suddenly appear without warning?" he inquired, following the two and maintaining a fixed gaze of red. The storm shielding was still in place and buzzing softly with electricity surrounding most of the buildings, due to Selk's evacuation protocols, but that was no justification for carelessness. "Both," responded Akana. "Several of the knights personally witnessed them rising as if made of earth, but leaving behind no visible change to the ground, except for a lingering miasma of ill feeling in the soil. Another Padawan had her back to a concrete wall, and even with 365 degrees of sight, she was nearly disemboweled when it appeared right next to her." The second headmaster repeated, frowning at the suggestion. "A Hyuga couldn't see it coming. Their eyes could detect infrared, and a much wider spectrum of light than other humanoids, so any technology that could have done this would have had to be specifically made to withstand their eyes. Humanoids had exceptional vision, and when combined with force abilities and the increased adrenaline of combat, it was almost impossible to approach them unprepared. There was little chance of this happening." "That means it's probably an unknown force technique, doesn't it, Master?" Itama remarked, tensing his grip on his weapon. As he and the other knight exchanged a silent glance, the second headmaster thought that would be the worst option, yes, because the creatures were already very dangerous, swift, and unlike any humanoid the GD had learned about, and the Order had received extensive education. They seemed to have limited sentience, but in fact, they had something like a hive mind or collective consciousness, and once a trick was used, they all knew it. As they learned, cunning, traps, and outwitting them were rendered useless, so adding force abilities to that. The second headmaster changed the subject as Itama's anxiety increased, asking, "What reinforcements did you acquire?" The younger Senju and his master shouldn't have been on this battlefield, but they were there by chance when the initial attack occurred, and there wasn't enough time for them to be sent out, because of the lack of dormancy. Many other GD would have died before they could even alert the temple to the attack, and Knight Akana's ability to defeat numerous attackers so effectively in spite of his intellectual competence would probably have been described by the first headmaster as a rare gift from the force. When they returned to the road, they had to dodge large crates that had been left behind near a store during yesterday's evacuation, and the knight quickly turned left through a large opening in a smaller building to take a shortcut to the next street. A merchant who happened to be nearby, he said. The man was not sneered at by the second headmaster. He nodded, a merchant, his temper rumbling slightly before he let it out to the force. The idea itself, though. Employing a trader in a battle zone. More like a jack of all trades. The second headmaster's anger spiked back up in the force, and Itama pricked up a little before fading, but he swiftly smothered it and added Mr. So the clone man is back. The fact that his teacher had lost all sense was hardly the student's fault. Yes, the Radid replied, with a hint of sincere irritation. It appears that he came 2 hours ago. Squinting, the second headmaster said, we closed all ports close to this city, due to the last 37 hours of sporadic attacks. As it was, the boy just shivered uneasily and actually drew nearer to his master, who glanced back but did not bring up Itama's response. The brat took it as a challenge, the knight replied, slashing out to the left to grab 3 enemies, before whipping them into the ground with enough speed to kill them in a shattering crunch of bone and flesh. The second headmaster frowned at the gory scene that was performed in front of the 14-year-old beside them, but there were only so many ways to kill using telekinesis. After some effort, Itama said, Mr. Clone Man is a buddy, I suppose. Before I became a Padawan, Master Sandman met him once or twice, and he only occasionally showed up. Well, perhaps more often than not quite a bit. The second headmaster remarked, you take him on missions, not knowing how to respond to Sandman Akana's seemingly inconsiderate and disrespectful lack of professionalism. Sandman Akana took preparation and planning to a deadly degree. The knight actually chuckled, he is an adult, and he simply shows up. I take the brat nowhere, he's highly force sensitive. I'm nearly positive that he's close to my level of strength and raw power. His awareness of minute details concerning things that catch his attention is also impressive. I think he can actually feel where we are, Itama said as they darted through one of the rare crystal parks, despite the water spraying up from a broken fountain. He meets us in transit sometimes, so it's not like someone's telling him where we're going or anything, although I think he actually tracks down Master Sandman rather than me, because he never finds me first if we're in different places, Itama said. To my great misfortune, Akana continued. Padawan Itama grinned broadly behind his teacher's back and mouthed, they're friends, they like to quarrel. If he had been willing to close his eyes in this case, he would have been inclined to pinch the bridge of his nose, but he persisted. That hardly changes the fact that there's no benefit to having an untrained civilian here, he continued. Force potential means nothing if not trained, he stated. A face without a lid and a half. While the fool may often fail to prepare sufficiently enough, he's acceptably capable, certainly more preferable than the numerous other sentients that we cannot evacuate, and you'd prefer not being here. And his skills? The second headmaster asked, raising one eyebrow. Akana didn't appear motivated to answer, save for a little bent of his head in the direction they were traveling. At least his Padawan was more courteous, despite the child's sudden and unexplained uncertainty. Well, the child said before vanishing. In the north-central area bordering the scrublands, the second headmaster began to run when he heard a distant rumbling explosion close to the spaceport. Other smaller, strangely consistent explosions soon followed. Certain projectile weapons, blasters, and compact explosives don't produce the right sound. He reasoned that there might have been some waiting to be carried in the spaceport. One of the others might have used the stock to help manage the population if the monsters had reappeared there. Itama gave a faint laugh from where he and Akana were trailing him. The child said, he's a bit explosive. That's your merchant, shouted the second headmaster as they rushed. The knight glared at him and replied, I don't take responsibility for the brat, but there's a reason he hasn't killed himself sneaking around my missions. Not the subtlest person in a fight though, Itama said. Using explosives violates local laws on the majority of planets, and brings about property damage that would get you noticed on others. He shouted as they finally reached the city's center square and turned north to approach the spaceport. Well, to be fair, Mr. Clone Man doesn't really blow things up without a purpose, or, in areas where it's too troublesome to avoid getting arrested, and Master Sandman's already informed him that was the last time we were bailing him out. Am I hearing this correctly? The second headmaster stopped looking at them and reflected. Apparently sensing the tone of his earlier remark, he saved us a month of time and an encounter with the Hutts, and he only got caught because I messed up. It wouldn't have been right to leave him there like that, Itama angrily objected, and he did deserve it. Akana's flatter than normal appearance implied that he would have been more than happy to leave the brat there to deal with the fallout, because his Padawan's embarrassment about the circumstance probably further encouraged the merchant to keep popping up. Second headmaster. From the spaceport entrance, the red-haired GD waved to them. Master Mito, he said, what's the situation like in this area? We've cleared the southwest quadrant for now with nothing sensed in the south central or west central, he continued. She said, it's under control, waved them in with a warm greeting for Akana, and grinned at Itama. We had a few mass swarms suddenly manifest out of the tarmac in the landing areas outside, but some unusual help allowed us to deal with them quickly wholesale before they spread out further, she continued. The explosions from earlier? He asked dryly. Not exactly our normal methods, she replied with a grin, but it's quite fortunate this time. We only have 7 GD on the ground right now. Without being able to identify how the creatures are arriving and stop them, we simply don't have the ability to cover the entire city with these few people. Akana looked at him and replied, do we have any information on them at all? Nothing from my network matches what we have here. No, replied Mito. Naitabisu and his student have been unable to find anything that remotely matches so far in the archives on Coruscant, and the Corellian archives are younger. It's unlikely they have it, but we've asked another team to search there as well. At this point, we're referring to them as drones, because of the apparent collective mind. The second headmaster modified his preparations as much as could to account for the limited number of fighters. I was informed that another 13 GD at minimum were en route to help contain this, he remarked. Why have none of the other backup teams arrived? There's a large ion storm going on that started engulfing the main hyperlane route nearby this planet. Anyone who didn't manage to get in ahead of it is having to divert to avoid it. It's adding on to the travel time, so the next arrival won't make it for a minimum of 9 hours, and they'll be staggered coming in, Mito grumbled. They might be able to sleep in turns because the attacks had a consistent timing pattern, but they had started 2 days earlier, and every GD in the room had been at work for at least 15 hours. The Kana would have already dozed off from tiredness from surviving the first 10 hours, with only his Padawan, and then the rest, if his attack style hadn't been so physically basic. As it was, the knight was probably hiding a migraine from severe force overuse, exacerbated by the focus needed for his work. Moreover, none of the GD dossiers he had read prior to accepting this task indicated any species whose circadian rhythm was designed to last more than 31 hours. Do we have information on methods for killing them? They're very resilient and they can regrow limbs with time, but beheading is effective, and Akana verified that mass trauma also puts them down. Well, you can always blow them up, was a cheerful voice input. A young blonde man with long hair concealing his left eye approached them, tossing a tiny cylinder up and down in a carefree manner. Except for an open messenger bag dangling from his left hip, which raised suspicions in the second headmaster's mind, and an oddly active force signature for someone who was supposed to be totally untrained, he was clothed like a spacefarer. Hello Mr. Clone Man, Itama said. Hey kid, nice to see you haven't gotten yourself gutted, stabbed, blown up, or kidnapped to be a paramount to some sick old freak with control issues and bad hygiene, Itama groaned quietly and covered his face with one hand, while Mito and the second headmaster arched their brows at the student-teacher pairing. Did you make the crossbow yourself or did you hire a professional to do it? The Kana said, ignoring them both. I am absolutely capable of making my own supplies, Sandman no Dana. There's not a flawed part in this entire get-up this time. I checked it twice like you showed me, and besides, the clone man responded with a sneer. The bow is just a delivery system, Itama stared at them both a little anxiously, but when the blonde motioned for him, Itama slid over and argued silently, while the man started packing him full with what appeared to be little birds. The second headmaster tried to find out what planetary tongue Dana might be from, and whether he had heard that accent previously. Conversely, Mito turned and gave Akana a glance that her fellow Redeed reciprocated, both wrists crossed, but fingers free. Not saying it's not, kid, but that lightsaber is short range and you're not a natural with it. Take them and try not getting killed. Funerals are boring, even if GD ones are mildly artistic, and Dana will be totally bitchy to deal with if you kick it, There's nothing artistic about any funeral service, you ill-educated Philistine, Akana continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. You set people on fire. Your predilection for arson doesn't give it artistic flair. It's the ambience and the symbology that makes it art, even if it still sucks as art and could be improved by. Blowing up bodies isn't suitable, nor is it art in any. Mito interrupted, looking at the two men and raising her eyebrows. If we could kindly stay on the pertinent topic we're currently concerned with, that would be appreciated, she said. You see, Itama mouthed at the second headmaster, and escaped the clone man's distracted slap to the head. They like to argue, I told you. The first headmaster had earlier bet Mito a large amount of Naboo treats, that Akana lacked the physiological potential to react significantly to anything, thus it was surprising when the second headmaster allegedly admitted this. With the authority of an established GE master, Mito's words, come along, were a subliminal command. I have a droid working on an accurate city map to mark the points where they've appeared and when, and it should be finished consolidating all the available data from the last few days, Mito stated. And if it's random, the clone man asked inquisitively as he stepped into step with Akana. And I'm quite interested in finding who made this particular pattern, Mito remarked as he peered out toward a spacecraft that was parked. You'll find that very little in life is truly random, Mr. Clone Man, so long as you've got the mind to see the hidden patterns, replied Mito. The second headmaster said sharply once more, who? Call it a feeling, Master Mito remarked, humming plainly. Whatever their views, second headmaster and other foundlings had practically been brought up with the present GD order code from birth. Despite his own inability to manage his emotions and his sometimes arrogance, second headmaster had always done his best to protect the code, which was a fundamental part of their identity, unlike the rare GD who received training later in life. After all, there was a lot of wisdom in the code. There is no passion, there is no chaos, there is harmony, there is no death, there is no feeling, there is peace, there is ignorance, there is knowledge, and there is the force. Naturally, there was also the older GD's less formal advice. Fear leads to the dark side, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to pain. During meditation and everyday life, GD prudently avoided or handled all of these feelings. The second headmaster, however, hated deserts. It could have been more intense than he should have let it be, but he had tried his hardest to restrain the incessant irritation that particular setting had sparked. Since even GD were susceptible to the tendency toward excessive discourse that pervaded so many sentient species, it was more ludicrous than the seething emotion that GD everywhere warned against. Once you had a kind group of fellow GD who would willingly do paperwork acrobatics or even grovel to the council if necessary to save you from being partnered with them on another desert mission, it was impossible to deny the presence of a problem. In the past, it was his otherwise proudly affectionate master's total sadness. Even in the face of subtle or overtly prejudiced remarks that had caused a teenage second headmaster bite his tongue to keep quiet, the woman had been a true Twi'lek and a genius herself. She had only ever approached frazzled when he and the desert were together, according to second headmaster. In other words, he became increasingly irisy, aggressive, and irritable and sharp-tongued, the longer he was forced to live in a desert. Evidently, it was more difficult to balance the heat, diplomacy, fellow sentience egos, and the potential danger when dealing with a teenage boy human who had to drown in sunscreen to avoid broiling, and who quickly transformed into a knife-sharp, grumpy, pathological truth-teller, who didn't care how many blasters were armed and in the room. The second headmaster was never amused by his master's sentimental recollections of how much more diplomacy she had learned during his teaching years, compared to the rest of her career, even though he couldn't exactly disagree with her. The original headmaster had always found the entire situation amusing, much to the chagrin of all their friends and former creche co-workers. Second headmaster was obviously unenthusiastic from the moment he saw the destination on the mission brief, as all the GD on this mission had previously collaborated with him on prior non-desert operations. Since few GD were willing to act out in front of such a respected master, and because Mito had a way of calmly inspiring people with her skills, competence, and manners, having Master Mito there to look into the root cause meant that there was less chance of an interpersonal conflict in the first place, even though he was officially leading the task team on dealing with this threat. Although he still didn't understand why the older woman paid attention to his self-proclaimed brother, second headmaster always found her to be quite pleasant and peaceful. Because there were so many competent and talented GD on board, the second headmaster remained optimistic that they would complete their objective even after they had touched down. If the force and chance were on their side, they would discover out what was happening with as few innocent casualties as possible, and hopefully without any personal deaths. The fact that they would not be lucky this time was regrettable. "Alright, everyone," Mito called calmly, ignoring the city and government officials hovering uncertainly to her left. Notably, Clone Man had joined them instead of the onlookers, reserving the spot on the other side of Akana from Padawan Itama, and grinning amiably at Knight Kamizuki's sidelong glance. They had ended up gathering within the shielded hangar of the local spaceport, after the other knights had come back in from their separate parts of the city. Shields would prevent any surprise attacks if the drones broke pattern, so it was safer to do this, but it did mean that all of the big fish who had come to meet the GD, as well as the citizens who had been at the spaceport or worked there when the evacuation order was issued, could see them. Everybody in Selk had been quite angry because Knight Akana had rationally demanded that the local tunnels that connected the underground city structures be shielded off as well, even though it was customary to leave them open when the shields went up for a storm lockdown. He and Mito had been asked by the local mayor to revoke that order as soon as they landed, and the second headmaster had not taken much pleasure in giving a succinct explanation of why they would not be doing so, since they were unaware of the limits of the drone's ability to appear in various places. Since Mito appeared to be safer than him, he found some tiny satisfaction in the fact that all of the officials now avoided him. It was humorous to all the GD present who had seen Mito fight during demonstrations before. Master Mito gave a nod to the small robot next to her, which triggered a hologram and beeped. A distinct grid was superimposed over the city when it quickly zoomed in on an aerial view of Selk from the planetary image of Samaria. Given the information provided by Knight Akana and the Sumerian government, you are all aware that the attacks have been ongoing for roughly 38 hours now, with periodic breaks ranging from 5 to 8 hours. However, by utilizing satellite-based technology to better document the locations for each attack, we've discovered that this is incorrect. Tiny, individual red pins and larger bright blue circles soon filled the city's display. Each blue circle encompasses a group of drones that manifested together. As you can see, they're concentrated wholly into the western and central quadrants, with the south central having nearly no attacks, and the northwest quadrant having 1.5 times as many manifestations as any other quadrant. Following that logic, I had R3 to 78 expand the map into the northwest scrublands to determine how large the radius was for these creatures. Night Hagane whistled softly, the map extending several dozen kilometers. A solid 60% of the appearances were clustered around a sunken crater just inside the desert, revealing nearly twice as many appearances. All of these have occurred starting 110 hours ago, but had gone unnoticed and unreported up to now, Mito stated, directing her gloomy look on a well-dressed Sumerian in the area, who courageously refused to back down from her gently critical comments. Under his arrogant facade, he yelled, Master GD, Jedis, the surveillance you were given access to doesn't report to a local level like our city government. We had no way of alerting you to the correct details about the matter. You're stating that you just didn't notice strange and murderous non-sentients appearing en masse outside your borders. Night Owl asked, raising an eyebrow over his patch as he turned his remaining lavender eye to the civilians. His Padawan seemed to be caught between agitating the civilians with her own identical eyes, and fussing over a shallow gash she was bandaging on her master's arm. Hagane sputtered briefly, but was cut short as one of the security guards behind him snorted. Of course not a single gnat of Sumerian air heads that way, and all the roads and pathways head out towards the east and south. Ain't no reason we'd have seen him, he muttered, staring back with a split lip and his arms crossed, as they all turned to face him. To his right, behind their goggles and rebreathers, Knights Guzu and Meizu exchanged a quiet message. They then discreetly signed it out with a flash of tea-rose and tangerine-colored fingers. The second headmaster narrowed his crimson eyes at the almost palpable anxiety radiating off the majority of the citizens in the spaceport and inquired, isn't a path straight north the most efficient way to reach the subregion's capital? Years later, his master's acceptance of the clandestine interior decorating task still infuriated the second headmaster. Well yeah, the man laughed, but you're not gonna get anyone willing to go that way. It's bad luck, better to swing east a bit and then head north. As Ao's gaze was diverted to the second headmaster, Mito said calmly, what type of bad luck? Ao used a more common dialect to say that anything in that area felt and looked strange to the Hyuga and Kaldor pairs, respectively, after the Elder Knight confirmed that the other knights were watching, and the second headmaster blocked the official's view. The lethal kind, he observed dryly. It's just a superstition, asserted another official, sneering tightly and dismissively gesturing to the GD with a tense hand. Not when it's got a body count, it ain't. How long has this bad luck been prevalent? The second headmaster questioned sharply, before pride or embarrassment could mask the truth in an attempt to preserve face. Always, sir, said a different security officer politely. The town's quite a few centuries old at this point, but that area has been trouble since the very beginning. People don't come back sometimes or they come back strange. I can't quite describe it, but it's just not right over there, and it's more so the closer you are to that hole in the ground. The polite man beside him screamed over his shoulder. That part's more recent though, area's the same, but the ground there caved in about. Hey Jarek. The polite man beside him held his nose in agony and questioned, when did that curse hole open up? The second man struck the first on the arm and got a glimpse, his hands still over his face. I think it was about 6 years ago, perhaps, Master Jedis, he replied. What was that for? The second headmaster ignored the muttering denunciations about proper conduct, thinking, it seems unlikely to be related directly to this incident with that kind of time gap, but the location is a definite concern. When he said, 6 years. We could divide in half, leave one group here and send in the other to investigate at the beginning of the next 5-hour gap, Kamizuki said. It would give the group more time to explore and impede it while safely escaping before they linger long enough to get outnumbered. Mito scowled and said, we might well use that method, but we have two major problems. She lightly tapped the droid once, and the indicators disappeared from the map, then reappeared one after the other in a loop. The second headmaster's frown deepened as the time-lapse went on, and he was aware that Padawan Himawari's unusual use of profanity had caught the attention of the others. As you can see, Mito continued, there is no 5-hour gap. While it is true that the town goes a minimum of 5 hours without attack, the creatures are appearing for a duration of 1 hour every 3 hours. They simply skip the town every other repetition, while continuing to appear at the sinkhole. So our window's smaller than expected, said Ao unhappily. On the current time image, the hologram came to a standstill, exposing a sinkhole that was nearly completely blacked, because to the red pins covering it. The second headmaster said, true, but it's not the problem I'm concerned with. After all, the town is free of drones, because we've been steadily killing them as they appeared. The depression has been under their focus for more than 4 days with no interference, he stated. The fact that they had to discuss this in public was very unfortunate, but the authorities had caused such a commotion that it had not been worth the time to remove them. The lack of faith in them seemed to offend even Itama, who is without a doubt the nicest person here. The soldier from before said, fucking shit, in the background. As the villagers' muttering and terror surged in the background, Mito and the second headmaster exchanged a flat gaze. Although it seemed like a small clusterfuck due to the many problems. For his mask, Guzu said gravely, "Do we have the luxury of waiting until the other GD arrive, Master Mito, Knight's second headmaster? If we wait longer, their numbers simply increase," he said. Master Mito turned to the second headmaster, his head tilted slightly in invitation, and he nodded back before addressing the others. Given the staggered arrival times of the reinforcements and how long until the next, I don't believe we should wait. If their rate of growth holds steady, they'll be unmanageable by the last arrival. Even at the most optimistic projections, there's also the possibility that they might achieve whatever their goal is at the sinkhole before then, and lose interest. And if they turn those numbers against us in this urban battleground, we've already lost, the second headmaster thought, signing what he could with his hand half hidden by his sleeve. This would imply that the town might lose those numbers. The others signaled their agreement to hide the unspoken option from the audience. What we need to do at this point is look at the available information on the specific area as quickly as possible, and formulate a plan of action that will confront the drones in more manageable numbers. The sinkhole is in desert area, rather than the shrublands nearby, which makes for treacherous footing at the best of times. They all stopped to think over the situation before Akana closed her eyes and sighed. Ignoring the hologram, the Radids started. Assume you have immunity for helping in a GD mission on behalf of the public. Exactly how many explosives do you have hidden on your ship? The blonde's chuckle was deep and low, and it ended with a toothy, eerie smile. Anna, I always have enough supplies to make my art as big and impactful as I want. To say that it had an impact would be an understatement. Instead of sitting far away and waiting for the concussive blasts to stop, their crew would have benefited even more from being allowed to approach the sinkhole. For something that could get past security, the clone man's bombs did far too much damage. And a savagely loud parody of dominoes falling in the wake of the manned spacecraft, they ripped through the masses of drones one after another, leaving bloody chunks of white-green flesh and other fragments, scattered around the kilometer-wide abyss. Meizu chuckled and pointed an orange finger at the raging destruction. Your boy toy has some nice tricks, Akana, he murmured, tilting his goggled head toward the Radid. The Keldor Knight was crouching behind their sand dune, and Akana turned his head gently to face him. You would believe that Meizu had just suggested that he have sex with the hut because of his repulsed and flat demeanor. The other man burst out laughing. After giving his twin a simple shoulder shake and hanging his head, Guzu grabbed Meizu's hood and pulled it up over his orange head, shoving the laughing knight into the sand face first. My apologies, Akana, Guzu said. We've been on assignment in the Outer Rim too long, and all his behavioral training's gone to the dogs. He's even forgotten how to roll over and beg. That's not what she said, Meizu muttered evilly, causing Hagane to snort on the second headmaster's right. Of course it's not, Akana replied. For her to say anything would require that a woman not avoid your very presence. I'm considering drowning them in the sand dune, the second headmaster said Kamizuki, stubbornly ignoring the fact that Meizu's attempt to leap to his feet in offense was being hindered by his brother's weight, pinning him down with an elbow between the shoulder blades. Well, you could do that, yeah, replied Kamizuki, retracting his brown locks from the bracelet, but it looks like the bombs are starting to trail off, and there's still an awful lot of those things down there. Might as well keep them around to help until Master Mito can look at the cleared area and fix whatever's wrong. Hagane smiled widely and held out his green tattoo as he nodded. Besides, there's a handy sinkhole right there. You can always shove them into it when we're done, he added. With a quick retort, Meizu pushed his brother away from him once more. Take off your wraps and go fondle some lingerie, you kiffer bastard. If I go in, I'm dragging you with me, said the man. Akana frowned at the settling explosions and said, it's hard to feel through the ambient darkness, but I think the bombs have further destabilized the area. It feels like the edges of the sinkhole are crumbling inward. At this rate, we might all get dragged in, she added. Alright, the second headmaster replied, his lightsaber still unlit. Everyone keep a distance from the pit itself. They don't seem to have issues with the footing, and we don't need to give them any advantages if it gives way beneath us. Knights Guzu and Meizu, Knights Hagane and Kamizuki. Your two teams, and Akana will work with me. There's no real advantage for us in cover approaching unawares, but keep in mind their ability to materialize from the ground. We can't be certain that they only do it on the timed patterns. If this is their real goal, they might call reinforcements. The second headmaster turned to the others as the combat was about to begin. If we must leave, we must go to a large enough open space for Clone Man to lower the spacecraft, because he has declared that he will stay in the air and out of attack range. R3-78 says blasters have a 40% chance of hitting them, but if we need to board, the suppressive fire will let us. Work with your partner, don't get separated, and try to keep an opening at your back in case you need to retreat, he stated before bowing and putting his hands together. May the force be with us. May the force be with us, the others repeated, bowing back. Then it began. Clone Man whistled softly at a fast-moving GD on the display feed, saying, would you look at that, The most noticeable thing from an aerial view was the neon gleam of the lightsabers leaving afterimages as they blazed through the twilight landscape, chopping apart their opponents in twisting dances across desert sand. Given the whirlwind of whitish bodies being flung into the air without anyone touching them, the 2 green, 2 light blue, 1 dark blue, and a stationary burnt orange that were held straight up had to be Sandmen. You know, I keep saying that Dan is a work of art himself, and he still doesn't get it, but look at this. He's like a human storm, a motionless, blazing center surrounded by absolute chaos and unpredictability, there with no warning and gone with no sign it happened, but the wreckage left behind, just a brief instance of skill and power which can never really be captured for future generations, truly a transitory masterpiece. And so ironic given that Dana thinks anything that doesn't last has no value as art. How illuminating, Mr. Clone Guy. Perhaps you could concentrate on explaining what's happening for those of us without ringside seats, said Master Mito, in a voice as dry as the planet Ax, across the comms. He changed switches and slowly elevated the ship just enough to re-display all 6 fighters. Is your cool satellite footage not working? He said. There have been complications, she said in a beautiful way. GD Mito compared her to a polite rendition of the female Mandalorian mercenary he had once met in a bar, and her words sent a chill down the clone man's spine. Well, so far I've made an entrance and dealt with most of them from the air. You fellow GD seem slightly jealous, though, because they're hard at work to even out the kill count. No sign that I can see that they're popping up more of the weeds around, but the sinkhole got wider under the stress. Are there any signs of potential causes yet, she asked. The clone man laughed, leaning back in his chair and extending his hands to his distant audience. And how exactly am I to know that? Luckily, I never received GD training. I can go straight down and take that white-haired mansicle if you want to explain the magical stuff. Or, if you'd rather, Dana, who knows how to detect the imperceptible tugging of threads. Are we still fighting the battle? That is, in fact, what is it the GD asked authoritatively. The clone person muttered, they're moving on, as he glanced at the screen and increased the zoom. Toward the town's direction then came the sobering question. No, they're just moving away from the sinkhole, like rats abandoning a ship, he explained, frowning at the view. All of the monsters were either leaving the crater or fleeing from it, however at one point several even approached the GD to try to kill them. I don't know, Master Mito, the clone man said suspiciously, and he quickly accelerated the ship to propel it higher and to the side away from the sunkland. He whispered, I feel bad about this, Swinging to the left, the second headmaster immediately decapitated a drone, threw it to the ground, kicked backwards into another to land on top of it, crushed its skull with a reinforced elbow, rolled back up, and blocked the drone's flight path to keep it from fleeing. 7 others had slipped by him in those few seconds. The Kana caught everyone in his reach, and hurled them back in front of the second headmaster at high speed, before hurrying for another batch to go around them both. Earlier, when the second headmaster had flown around him, the knight had been a highly effective long-distance support, but the drone's altered conduct was making things intolerable. Eyes half-masked, the telekinetic murmured, they stopped focusing on us, and sped off to follow their adversaries. As he and Kamizuki continued to weave in and out of the escaping forces, Hagin yelled, from a quarter of a mile around the sinkhole. What's the plan now? He said. Be careful not to let them get to the town. There are no settlements in the other directions, he said. He was okay, but his lightsaber had descended from the focus position held in front of his chest, to stabbing forward sharply like a scorpion's tail, suggesting that he was finally growing exhausted. Heading off another drone, he leaped backwards to capture a Kana in his periphery. I dislike it when something flees with no apparent cause, the Kana said plainly. It has yet to turn out well. The second headmaster concurred with him. We need to move further back to match where the others are heading. We can catch more running in that direction, and then hunt the others down, once the main threat to the town is finished. The other nodded, and both of them staggered as the earth trembled beneath them. The ground shuddered and bucked, and the sucking, grinding roar of sand rushing past them at high speed into the hull was accompanied by deep snapping sounds that echoed through the atmosphere. They appeared to be abruptly ensnared in a horrible concoction of an earthquake and a vortex. Being caught in it a few meters away was like being trapped in a riptide, with the sand at their knees pulling them backwards and the ground beneath their feet tugging forward into the hole. Thank goodness it hadn't hit them directly with that much weight. Then a real geyser of sand, not water, erupted from the hole's center, swept several dozen meters over their heads, and smashed back down around the edges. It was hard enough to keep track of Akana's presence behind him in the force, but the dust and particles in the air from this frenzy made it hard to feel the other 4 GD Knights, and just maintaining their position was all they could do. The beach. The darkness is encroaching on everything, the other man cried out. Get moving. He yelled over the loud clamor, avoid getting too near. The second headmaster quickly tucked his lightsaber away in his robes, trying to get to higher ground, his heart thumping and his ears ringing, but as soon as he freed his left foot and tried to brace himself on the sand, something jumped out and grabbed him. Fear struck instantly as more and more of the earth seemed to be sinking out from under him, and the second headmaster shoved it down. He gritted his teeth and struggled with both hands to hold on to something solid, but he kept sliding because there was nothing nearby to support him. His breathing quickened, and it was a wonderful relief when Akana's hand flew out to grab his right wrist, but something wrapped up his left leg despite his control, too focused and purposeful to be his head playing games with the sand. His whole body was braced on the ground, his eyes screwed tight against particles, and the second headmaster's eyes widened as he realized that the redeed had fallen so far into the sandpit that Akana couldn't have reached him without hitting the earth. The cautious cut through them did no good, though, for the wretched things were nothing but sand, and they simply reformed as he reached for his lightsaber and rekindled it, feeling another tendril creep up his right leg, and releasing his grip with his left hand, clenching tightly onto Akana's wrist. As he tried climbing again, the man's strength lay in detail work, and he was already exhausted, but Akana was having infinitely more success using his ability to brace himself against the unsteady ground, and get traction to pull without sinking. He cursed, pushing his weapon away, and lashing out with his crude telekinesis. The second headmaster knew, his stomach sinking even as he struggled desperately towards the surface and away from this dark, sapient sand, that although it isn't focused on him, he would exhaust himself before he can escape this sucking whirlpool. Everything in the world seemed to slow down for him for a moment, the snatching tendrils, the rushing sand, the darkness beneath and around them, the sticky, deeper darkness of the escaping drones, the sweaty warmth of Akana's wrist beneath his fingers, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears, all muffled. He let out a deep, steady breath, releasing all the horror and remaining anger into the force, as his fears faded under his decision. He thought, "It has been an honor to grow and live alongside you, first headmaster, my friends," trusting that the force would somehow deliver his message. The second headmaster turned back to Akana, his crimson gaze concentrated and serene, despite the constricting sand around his chest and waist. "I'm sorry, Sandman," he said. Then he broke Akana's wrist bones and dove under. Lucid dreaming was maybe the most pointless skill Madara has ever wasted time learning. He sighed in exasperation, stroking his hair and staring at the useless landscape, as the dream shifted unevenly from flaming fields of molten rock and bubbling lava bubbles to ugly, muddy plains, afflicted by a vicious, howling tornado that roared and rampaged without even fluttering his hair. Madara plugged his ears firmly against the roaring noise, and looked around in the vague hope that something familiar would appear, because at this point, the only thing that had happened as a result of following Makoto's advice, was that he was even better at remembering how annoying everything was when he woke up. If dream visions were useless, what was the sith damn point of them? When Madara reflexively tried to activate his eyes 2 months ago, it combined all the elements of the dream sequence into a single scene, slammed more noise, color, sound, and force impressions into Madara's brain than anyone could possibly handle, and made him jump up and throw up all of this, regardless of Izuna's assertion that the Sharingan couldn't be used during dreams anyway. It was excruciatingly unfair to spend 3 days feeling as if you had sustained a serious concussion, without even having the excuse of being in a fight to support it. "Ah, yes," Madara sketched as the scene faded away, the colors flowing like water down a drain. "Here we have our scheduled switch from Tornado Planet to the pitch-black planet of giant trees," she added. Almost exactly as he had named it, it was a damp planet with enormous trees, many times larger than anything he had ever seen, which may have been a mark of identification in and of itself, but he only knew they existed because he had stepped into a trunk several countless dreams before. He literally couldn't see the hand in front of his face, and since sight was the Uchiha's inherited strength, Madara couldn't identify plants by touch, and tree bark wasn't dangerous unless it was covered in moss, in which case it was moss-covered bark. If Madara trusted his force-damned luck for anything, it was to help him find the one colony of poisonous or parasitic moss in an otherwise harmless acre of forest. But let the fanged god forbid that the dream stalled in this scene again, because that had happened more than once, and it had given Madara several reasons to frantically withdraw all his complaints about wanting light in favor of being really fucking specific about wishing for sunlight. The kind of light he wanted was not bioluminescent skittering creatures that triggered every danger sense he had developed over decades of doing dangerous shit, especially when they proceeded to hunt him down over several kilometers for what seemed like hours. It was even more obvious to him that they were smart enough that it was no coincidence that they led him to other things that tried to kill him. It all happened in a gloomy setting. There was a lot of worry about that. Only because Makoto was cruel enough to refuse to share the blackmail and kind enough to admit that he had really freaked out, she still hadn't forgiven him for using force lightning to burn her hardwood floor during his outburst over a stick insect last month. Was he not being inundated with demeaning reminders of it from Fugaku and Izuna all the time? "Why do all the people I care about behave so badly?" He side-eyed the dark void aimlessly and questioned out loud, when something invisible skittered over the ground to his left. "You're the only thing that everyone you know has in common if they are all jerks." Madara jumped back, muscles releasing, as the partially perceived presence lay at his back, invisible. "Aren't you the kindest sentient being on this side of the core?" The person at his back, a humanoid and perhaps male, Madara had previously surmised, had become more solid over the past few weeks, despite the fact that the vision itself had branched out and contained more clouded elements, including a silent firefight and an old building that was falling to ruins and reeking with the feel of death, fear, and bewildered confusion. It was comforting to have someone by his side through it all, even if the only image he had of them was a blurry photograph of a hooded figure painstakingly searching through old books, real books, while Madara strode between shelves in a clear, foggy archive. A high-pitched buzz sliced through the air behind him, and something inhuman screamed as it thudded to the earth. "Relax, Madara," he heard, "and we will find it, and we will mend things. There is always a path forward to the future, we just haven't discovered it yet." "I bet you got an A+ in fortune cookie comfort," he muttered, his mouth moving mindlessly as he rubbed against a muscular back. "Did they teach you that as well?" he said, as the soil turned into a man-made path hanging over countless kilometers of open air. Madara smiled and sighed quietly in exasperation. "I have no idea what those are, but you can be certain that you're being a fool. Those are poisonous, so don't buy them, you fool. They're orange, not green." "There," Madara replied, realizing that he had lost his sense of reality and had grown more engrossed in the picture. "What are we doing? Who are you? Do you know?" "Waiting," a voice murmured impatiently, the air tinged with the odor of refiltered air. A red, ominous light crept up behind Madara, and a heavy presence fell upon them both, as if they were being watched. "Yes, but what is the reason?" His demand was, "What must we do? Can you help me out? Is it not feasible?" "By that, what do you mean?" "It's all for naught if you don't get there on time." Heat rose from above, and a fierce wind blew sand in Madara's face, and he startled, turning to grab the other when he saw movement, but... Done, done. Madara woke up and thrashed on the edge of his bed, desperately trying to grab the fitted sheets, as he heard brass instruments screaming close to his ear. However, gravity defeated him, and he fell to the ground in a heap of tangled material and a fit of humiliation. "Fails," he snarled. The droid beeped back at him in binary with a series of sing-song, happy noises, then started blaring the criffing march at full power. "Can you hear me?" he said. "I will end you." Bumbles craned his neck back and shook a menacing finger at it with his left arm. "I will force punch you into a wall, render you back to your component parts, and donate what's left of you to the clan's school for kids to practice on." "Bumbles, what will you do?" "Bumbles. BB-03," he yelled. The shitty astromech rolled to a stop next to where his black hair had been splayed out across the floor, and gave a long sad beat towards his upside-down face, as the racket trailed into silence. Bumbles extended a small manipulator arm, picked up a tangled chunk of his hair, and carefully dropped it back down on his shoulder instead of the floor. Then it perked up and basically went to attention. Little antennas standing straight up and all the yellow circles on its black body rolled just right, so that it looked perfectly symmetrical. With his left shoulder throbbing and his right leg still twisted in the blankets, Madara just started drumming his fingers on the floor. Hissing, "That doesn't fix this." Bumbles seemed to sag, but Madara just swiped his outstretched arm at its head, and it rolled out of the way, turned its sensor back onto his prone body, gave a thoughtful beep, and then instantly clicked its holocamera before rolling around excitedly and beeping the droid equivalent of laughing its head off. "I told you to quit hearing what Izuna had to say. You have no line of shame in any part of your programming," he complained, lifting his head just to slam it to the floor. "They're not amusing." Bumbles stopped and gave a deep brrrrrrr and shook its head rapidly. "No," Madara said slowly, "no, they're not. I will reprogram your ass and throw Izuna into the waterfall hog-tied if this happens again. Just watch me." The displeased robot responded with a loud, abrupt SNNT. "What do you even want?" Madara groaned as he turned over and wrapped himself in a lump on the floor, after yanking the last of the bed's blankets off. His body ached for more sleep, but his mind refused to cooperate. He bitched, unsuccessfully trying to convince his body that, despite the fact that the metal floor beneath his cheek wasn't as comfortable as the bed, it was still a perfectly good place to sleep. Since he had already experienced the vision once tonight, it was much more seductive because he might truly fall asleep now. Regretfully, adrenaline and loud droids were against him. A few happy beeps prompted Madara to reach out from the covers and toss his pillow at the wretched monster. "Once we arrived, I instructed you to wait until I woke up. Don't wake me up when we arrive, you future scrap metal ball. You understood me perfectly. Describe one amazing instance where I relished being awakened early." Madara could tell that the tiny brat had twisted its body suggestively back and forth, without even taking his head off. Bumble's pitch went smoothly up and down. "Go, move the ship onto the Rima trade route, so the Uriageans don't think we've broken down or something," he shouted angrily. "Get out of here, you voyeuristic annoying malfunction." Bumbles flipped out its welding torch vertically and wheeled away happily. The motion could have been the droid's attempt to be charming and give him a thumbs up, or it could have been the droid's way of merely kicking him off, but Madara had never been able to be sure what it meant. Despite the lack of sufficient evidence to support either position, Madara declined to investigate for two reasons. It would first require Bumbles to admit that he couldn't always read it, which was a surefire way to end things badly. And if Bumbles hadn't really considered sending him off yet, Madara wasn't giving the little brat the impression. Madara groaned, crooked a beckoning finger, and made his pillow float back over to him. I should just rename it Little Shit, he said. That was a bad idea, of course. The following time he went back to the clan, he would call Bumbles that aloud without thinking, and he would immediately annoy all the parents in the area. Like the theatrical brat he surely still was, Fugaku's youngest was out in the galaxy someplace looking to make something of himself, after he had fled at the age of 10, thus it was absurd that even Fugaku would give him this scowl of disapproval. Madara was clearly far from the worst influence in life, as he had little to do with the weird messies he called nephews. He was only a few hours into his scheduled sleep cycle when Bumble's little trick startled him awake, which was a little strange considering the dream hadn't been abruptly interrupted. When the pillow was within reach, he snatched it up, fell onto his back, and pushed it beneath his head. Even if his body cried out for it, the dull ceiling was not enough to put him back to sleep. He had to go to the extra bother of recording everything and mailing it home to be put to the archives, because the clan could not readily record things that were subjective or just exhibited less frequently. The last thing Fugaku wanted to endure was inquisitive relatives making up hypotheses about what was going on, and presenting them to him every 5 minutes, so at least he was obliging to Madara's command that everything be sealed until this was handled in some way. Even though they wouldn't have willingly disclosed anything to those who don't share their beliefs, it would have been there. Overcoming a librarian's stubbornness is far simpler than assembling disparate facts and hoping they're true. Madara thought bitterly, if only we had better resources, recalling all tales of the GD, and all the evidence he had discovered that suggested the tales were true. He rubbed both palms down his face and grunted silently. It had taken him 3 additional months of searching the last time he had found contradicting historical facts about Alderaan to figure out if it was the Alderaan or the records from Naboo that were right. Finding that the Naboo documents matched their obituaries was annoying, since it implied that someone had previously tampered with Alderaan, even while it was good to know that the Naboo material was presumably intact. Either someone handled the publicity, there had been cover-ups, or it was a component of that illogical lash-out reaction in the early decades. He had collected and examined a great deal of information, but he still lacked a firm grasp of the hows, whys, and woes if there was a who at all. He possessed terabytes and holobooks of data that supported sound assumptions about what was going on and the approximate location and time of the beginning, but none of it provided him with a strategy for moving forward. So tiring, he looked at nothing and bitched to himself. As he raised his left hand and stared blankly at the faded wounds from the island crystal splintering all over his palm, his face became blank. He believed, I don't have any way to fix it. There's still no way to do anything about it all, he replied. As Madara shakily breathed in and out and ground the heel of his palms against his burning eyes, the force around him fell dark and thick, like a heavy damp blanket, and his weak attempts to relax and let go only served to reflect his own misery. It's been a while since I've been back, and even though it annoys me to feel like I've stopped again, I really use the sensation of peace and connection. He rolled onto his side once more and thought, perhaps I should go home for a break. He mumbled, we'll stop after this, balancing the force and calming his breathing with the comfort of an unnamed entity behind him. We'll check out this one last oddity and then go back home, regroup, restock, he sighed, figured out another place to check, get some fresh eyes to look it over maybe, he continued. Madara, please calm down. We will track it down and fix it. Hopefully, they're right, Madara thought, remembering that sense of confidence and iron resolve. Maybe he could fulfill his pledge if the Fanged One chooses to overlook him or even assist him in navigating this mess they're all in, and the winged goddess bestows her blessing on him. At that same moment, of course, the ship's intercom started playing the carking march again, with a metallic screech that had not been heard yesterday. He could have to do all of this without his droid because he was going to kill Bumbles. Madara hadn't decided exactly how he wanted to get rid of the annoying menace when he stormed into the cockpit, boots clicking against the floor as he shoved his left arm into his white-headed long coat, because getting dressed hadn't given him enough time to sort through the multitude of options that sounded appealing at the moment. There was always the option to start alphabetically, wait for its memory to re-upload to one of the backup bodies, and then move on to the next method on the list, though Madara wasn't sure he cared about that at the moment. But for someone with his short fuse, that sounded like a terrible precedent to set, and it also sounded like a lot of money and travel time all around. The small thermos of freshly brewed coffee that waited on his seat astounded him. Still narrow-eyed, he opened the container and took a small sip of the wonderfully hot tea, completely undisturbed by the familiar image of red pouring into Madara's eyes. Madara side-eyed Bumbles menacingly as she stared at it for a few seconds before picking it up and sitting down in the seat. The droid beeped encouragingly and for a few microseconds, the shutters on its sensor flickered cutely. He swallowed. He replied, you hear me? You get to live another day. Madara was a man of his word, and not a weak-spined sentient who made idle threats, so it wasn't that he didn't mean it when he claimed he would kill the droid. Bumbles beeped happily and carefully avoided bringing up the current tally of how many times Madara had said that. "Oh, fuck it," he grumbled as he leaned back in his chair and sipped more coffee. The first responders had already confirmed that the crash in the Rima trade route an hour ago was caused by an asteroid moving into the route, which was frankly suspicious, given the complete lack of asteroids or celestial bodies nearby. The Iriadu was broadcasting a high-priority message to all ships that dropped out of hyperspace as a result of the crash. As soon as he completed his first thermos and picked up the second one Bumbles had made, the droids started reporting. At least they could cross that off their list for this week, as Bumbles had taken the initiative to check for all available astronavigation updates, rather than just the pertinent one nearby. After looking over the readings on his datapad, Madara remarked, "You could have just gone ahead and updated the nav computer without waking me up." Madara sent out a few low-pitched pings and a silent snort. "You pick the most ridiculous times to refrain from initiative. You hardly have trouble presuming on a host of other topics, and it's not like you actually waited before updating today." Madara snapped a couple vertebrae and relaxed his shoulders, yawning. At least they wouldn't have to speak to the video screen anytime soon, even though his hair was still a knotted mess. Furthermore, it would have appeared less electrified hedgehog and more on purpose, if he had twice pulled the bulk through a hair tie to form a loose bun. "It doesn't look like anything vital for the next week or so, but after that I might have to start resorting to the ration bars," he remarked, flipping through the screens to the inventory list. "We're running low on a few essentials." The Bumbles fell theatrically sideways. "Precisely, let's avoid that. They're healthy, but that's all they have going for them, and I've already eaten more of them in one lifetime than any being should have to suffer through. Fuel looks okay, money looks okay, no emergency updates needed, no emergency repairs needed. Let's go ahead and schedule the secondary updates for when we're next planet-side somewhere with a strong subspace network. Holonet access would be faster if you can get it without breaking laws for a reasonable price. But I don't think anything on here is specialized enough that a regional network wouldn't have it anyway. Also, keep an eye on the minor repair areas on our to-do list. Go ahead and triage them for potential severity, and then look up the areas that have those parts for cheapest. We'll hit them as they become available if they're nearby." After accepting it, Bumbles inquired a questioning trill. "No, we're not stopping on Iriadu," he said, pushing a strand of hair back and glaring at the astromech. 1. I hate this planet. 2. I hate these people. 3. Foodstuffs are one of their major imports. It'll be cheaper to stop somewhere else to purchase things later. If none else, we can always pick a planet, and I'll hunt something down. Don't even." It only made a binary beep and tipped its head. "Yes, you were," he replied. "And before the jump, is there anything else we should talk about?" Lights flared on Bumble's helmet, projecting a transparent blue hologram of the nearby galaxy into the air. "Again, no, it's fine, knock it off. It's not like our destination doesn't impact you, and it is a bit weird this time," he added, raising an eyebrow at the robot as he reached into a nearby container. Madara shook his hand dismissively. He held the archaic piece of paper he had acquired on a low-tech world years ago in front of his face before closing his eyes. "Alright, go for it." It was impossible for Madara to pinpoint the exact location of the map, and his eyes reddened once again when he heard Bumble's beep and heard the droid's repulsor lift engage as it hovered and moved slightly. In some respects, it was far simpler to just sense the force and trust his intuition than to stare at it and attempt to decipher its currents. Most objects were blocked from light by the paper, but the Sharingan could still see force currents flowing through them. Depending on how he focused and what he was searching for, it tended to appear as a solid backdrop in space, with currents, eddies, and hundreds of subtleties. But using both was far more accurate. Madara unclipped the pad's pen and, still watching the force, grabbed for the rear of his holopod. His focus on their next location made the force respond to his own potential futures, even if the hologram on the map was only in substantial light and had no effect on the force itself. There were tumultuous bubbles of potential disaster and swirls of intrigue. The remainder of the force currents on the map moved entirely just by concentrating on one location, shaking and squirming, as though its foundations were shaky. Madara threw the stylus like a dart straight through the region, where the force was splintered like glass that had shattered on the ground and been reglued in place, even though he knew that trouble would emerge if they went there as well as he knew his own name. Since he had seen so few force locations with that type of stated result, they had to make it there whether it was perilous or not. As Madara lowers the paper, Bumbles casts an ambivalent glance at the blinking dot on the droid's map. "Looks like we're still heading to Utapau then." Bumbles rolled forward to ram the starport official's legs and yelled in wrath while beeping shrilly. With a frown, Madara used the force to seize Bumbles and pull it to his side. "The short translation of that is bullshit if you didn't catch it all," he responded. "Now try again because the port fees sure as hell didn't cost that much when I checked your net," he said. The sentient's face did not change, but the Tulapan narrowed its red-socketed eyes down at him as it looked at the droid Madara still held. A moment of subdued amazement appeared in the force as Madara flashed the Sharingan back at the sentient. Lion Grey skin shifted as he turned back to the holopet in his hands, after giving Madara what was probably supposed to be a grin. There was a benefit to being able to challenge people's preconceived notions about you when they initially think you're human. Since humans don't always get along well with species that don't fit human stereotypes, it also prevents them from simply copying and pasting their preconceived notions about you. The pawn's basic perception of Madara as an insolent child persisted, but at least he had diverted the man from impending animosity and into reluctant irritation. His blaster and electro staff were designed to handle adverse reactions, however it wasn't always the best option. The figures listed on Pao City's website are out of date and haven't been properly updated since the last offworlder came through. What I quoted you is indeed the current fee in galactic credits, stated the official. The limited service level spaceport is not an empty field, and nothing in the last few weeks points to an economic catastrophe. That's ridiculous, he muttered, giving Bumbles a little prod with the edge of his boot as it started to advance once more. Even though the Red Merlin is a small passenger carrier rather than a cargo carrier, it shouldn't be half that high. The official said, be that as it may, the fee is what it is. Given the site's false display, I can make an adjustment between the two numbers, but I cannot honor such a low rate in credits right now. Official Tianmem flicked the pad with the backs of his fingers. In the credits? Madara asked, observing the inadvertent emphasis, how about Whoopi Whoopi? Or Drugas? Even though Madara's head was still down, I paused and carefully fixed my eyes on him. Isn't that the issue? Sensing a strong confirmation of his hypothesis, he added, something happened and it ricocheted and dropped the exchange rate between currencies in the Outer Rim systems again. Forget converting the fee into Republic creds. What's the original fee in the different currencies you take? When they saw a burst overhead, Mem was about to reply, his body language shifting as he straightened. When they were on the west side of the huge hull of Pao City, it was simple to look up at the sky over the rocky eastern wall, because this spaceport was located on the edge of the second stratum below. Whatever it was a sight to behold, splintering the sky with red crackles of lightning that raged across the horizon, spitting out black wisps of light like charred mist, and forks of orange that seared across the blue sky, leaving behind afterimages of a great storm that had been stripped of all liquid and trapped on the ground, so it could only rage upward at the skies. It was bigger than anything Madara had ever seen in the Force. As it bucked and writhed across the surface to the east, it was power planetfuls of power condensed, burning, and flaringly chaotic, and it metaphysically slammed into everything around it, with the force of an asteroid crashing, and Madara bowed and staggered into Bumbles at the sudden pressure. It came without warning, without any hint beforehand, and it came suddenly. It was like losing gravity when it suddenly vanished. The pawn jerked his head away with the slow, jerky unawareness of a Force-blind being, who had been hit hard with the mental effect, and didn't recognize it, while official Mem stared at the now empty sky. Bumbles pressed against his leg and made a lost whine. Madara braced himself against one of his ship's landing struts, his hand buried in his hair, as he applied pressure to his throbbing temple, and he cautiously flexed his mental shields while popping his ears. Yes, we were discussing the fees in Whoopi Whoopi, the man said, staring blankly at his pad. Madara opened his mouth to speak, then, considering the increasing blankness and ambiguity that were spreading through the force of the city, abruptly changed his mind. Another tug of force caused his speeder to slide over in the ship with a screech to drop down through the opening. Madara flinched at the thought his poor bike made landing on the lift, but his brain felt almost half-numb from overstimulation, which apparently translated to an abrupt decrease in finesse. What are the speeding bike rules in the area? He asked, spinning towards the Merlin's open entry ramp and walking past it to the lowering cargo lift he just triggered. Bikes they aren't commonly utilized on Utapau. The Varactyls and Dactylians are the primary form of transport in city, the official asked, slowly recovering consciousness as Bumbles started beeping shrilly at the side of the bike. Madara prepared the bike and made sure the bike compartment was locked, just in case. He interrupted the robot complaints by saying, mistakes. Sort out the payment with the port, and then stick with the ship just in case. I'm going to check it out. He got on the bike, put on the gloves, put on the helmet, and kept the comm on, just as Bumbles was about to launch into another round of scathing condemnation of his life choices and sense of preservation. What do you think you're doing exactly? Tianmem objected, deciding to go back to normal in that unpleasant situation. After he switched the bike on, he said, my astromech BB-03 has access to our funds and negotiation rights. It'll handle payment while I'm away. I objected, surprisingly, stating, it's not made to fly more than a few kilometers without forward momentum. That's an F-29 swoop from Kaluta. You can't use it fast enough within the sinkhole without crashing. Maybe you can't, he snorted mockingly, and with a flip of a switch, the bike rose, and he looked at Bumbles, who gave him a dejected salute in response. Ignoring the blaring feel of crazy near-human. Coming from the pawn, he shot off the landing pad, angled along the sinkhole walls while the swoop warmed up, and then he swung and twisted the bike into a barrel roll to climb vertically along the rock wall, clinging to the bike with more strength than was naturally his, ramping up the speed for a few precious seconds before twisting sideways. As soon as he reached the minimum speed requirement, he shot across the open bowl of the city. Madara swerved around a bend, turned away from the setting sun, and went through an inverted corkscrew before heading east out of Pao City. In the dunes, the second headmaster expected to perish. Regardless of their strength, Jedis have always been more mortal than rumors suggest, and the second headmaster was no exception, as he had thought that letting go of Akana would be the end of him. 1 cubic meter of sand weighed more than a ton, and there was a lot more sand in this darkened death trap than that. But that's not precisely what happened. His hindbrain screamed for one final moment of life as instinct compelled him to hold his breath and close his eyes against the abrasive grains as the sand swirled around him, but instead of the blackness and sand crushing down till he burst like a rat trapped in a garbage crusher, it opened. Even years later, he would never be able to fully explain what had happened next. The force sparked and buffeted around him, the sand guiding rather than dragging, and instead of being dragged down, he was free-falling through an intangible nothingness, as the darkness in the sand blazed into power like an inverse star, horribly and paradoxically bright in his senses and through his eyelids. There was no oxygen but no suffocation, a sense of falling but no movement, and the second headmaster clamped down on his composure with grim resolution. If they had been there, it would have been enough to frighten even the most controlled master. Before crashing into a turbulent ocean of jagged waves, he gained direction again with a reassuring thrust of rough sand, as he fell through the knot space, the warmth of fire, the cold of death, and a dizzying fog. He felt the compressed water sweep him down in a vortex devoid of wetness, but the darkness was different and stronger, deeper and wider, like an engulfing envelopment waiting in the distance. He yelled and blew out the bottom of the sucking pressure as reality fell apart around him. The terrible sunfire of heat that burnt away every sensation of his body in its inferno as he just struggled to hold his presence together, was positively heavenly in comparison to the boiling updraft of steam that buffeted him skyward, no matter how smothering the indomitable presence in the force became. As he somehow breathed through the thick sludge sinking down his throat like mud down a drainpipe, he woozily tried to use it to track his body again, ignoring the sensation that his stomach was rising, and ignoring the sphere he was in as it seemed to slide along tracks, going airborne and spinning and reconnecting and shifting like a ride no amusement park could dare to meet, not without the help of the darkness that strengthened every stronger around him, radiating a gleeful, defiant freedom as it soared through every ounce of space he knew. He was just starting to understand the feeling of his fingers flexing when it all snapped. Torrent insanity reached out with insubstantial fingers to engulf its winged prey, and as it descended, so did he. The globe was drawn by cloying, insatiable hunger, and as dread, rage, and hatred tore through him, the soaring dark shouted without voice, scorching like rebar into his head. He fell, and as he fell, reality shattered around him, and the darkness and the pain were nothing compared to the emptiness that waited between the cracks of the world, a void of nothingness and energy and power of nature, that, if the transition didn't tear him apart first, would kill him like space kills any human. He could never surrender to the dark side and be himself, but what did that mean in this place outside of all places, where there was only warring darkness as deep and distinct as human hearts? Inky tentacles of darkness, solid as duracrete and untouchable as storm clouds, grasped for him. Even he could not decide whether it was better to die in the void or to be saved by this dark. Would his death be viewed as resistance or complicity? Instead, he felt a searing redness that seethed of defiant malice as the tentacles slammed into him, striking his ribs and sending him flying, away from the living tar that was cannibalizing that screaming, winged hatred, and causing him to feel physical pain and burning pain, as it caught him roughly. Teeth larger than temples are nestled inside a red-orange nova. Gidi, do your duty. The smooth powdery soil under his face when he woke up was almost more surprising than waking up at all. The world made sense again, and there was light all around him, gently dispelling the lingering feel of the dark side, and the second headmaster moaned weakly and just lay there, not bothering to move, not caring that the ground smelled faintly of ozone, and that there were wisps of darkness lingering all around him. Not even the pounding rawness inside his mind could take away the soothing peace he found in the light side at this moment. But it was overshadowed by the hazy sense of a darksider coming. The second headmaster was already at a disadvantage if this came down to a fight, because the left arm that was trapped beneath his body felt fine, if numb, but the shoulder was a hotbed of pain, raw, and the ache felt like it went all the way down to his scapula. Attempting to shift off his arm caused overwhelming agony through his shoulder and back, forcing him to stop and just breathe, as he tried to get it under control. His vision was doubled and blurred, making it impossible for him to move. The spine. The second headmaster's breath caught, and he didn't let it until he was able to slowly, although painfully, wiggle both feet's toes. He thought, I'd just have to trust the force that he didn't have any damaged vertebrae because he honestly couldn't feel it past everything else. He moved his arms out from under him, letting his weight shift slowly to the front of his right shoulder, and then he grabbed his lightsaber in his left hand and moved it to the side. The damage is severe, and I can't feel parts of it, except when I try to move, which says nothing good, but at least the spinal cord seems intact. With his lightsaber at his side, likely hidden behind the material he felt covering his hand, the second headmaster sat down once more and tried to concentrate on the monster approaching him. They were certainly strong, but he couldn't tell how strong they were, because his senses felt like they had been burned, and since the person didn't seem to be projecting at all, he or she might even be hiding most of their power at the moment, if they were trying to approach while being underestimated. It wasn't necessary, he thought grimly, knowing full well that he wouldn't even be able to defeat a senior Padawan at this point, that his only chance would be to underestimate and stealthily attack at close range, and that he would just have to hope the Darksider wasn't too arrogant to bring a ranged weapon like a blaster. But they didn't feel that dark. Rather, they felt like an explosive potential balanced on knife blades, ready to tear through obstacles with heartless rage, like a smoldering fire hidden in the forest litter beneath their feet, ready to rage, combined with the cloying thickness of smoke, and the lurking edge of poison concealed in almonds. The force he had felt after sinking beneath the sand was unlike any rogue GD he had ever met, even under the most insane of conditions. A Sith might be able to, but they had been destroyed nearly 1,000 years ago, so second headmaster had no comparisons to draw, though his standards might be highly distorted given his recent experience. But he wasn't certain. Calming his breathing, he tried to focus his healing energies on the most serious wound, and it was very disturbing that the energy gravitated immediately toward a wound near the top of his spine, but he ignored it for the moment, since there was nothing he could do about it, other than focus on what he could do, and his goal wasn't to heal everything. He wouldn't have time for that, but to keep himself alive, until his fellow GD could reach him. Assuming they could reach him in time, nothing about the vague surroundings he could see nearly resembled what he knew of Samaria. He heard a speeder stop a few yards away, and the second headmaster opened his eyes again to see a figure stepping off the bike, starkly backlit by the last of the sun, with a cylindrical object on their back, dark boots, a long, light-colored coat, and a mass of wild hair in a sloppy tie that fell out of their helmet when they took it off. He felt a heavy presence observing him, but he was careful not to get agitated. A woman, although he was unable to verify with the Force, their forward stride appeared odd for a female of most species. He closed his eyes as they came closer, waited until he felt them crouched a meter away, and then, after a moment's hesitation, the second headmaster's hazy eyes opened. Male, human-looking, with black hair, light skin, and slightly glinting red eyes. Red. The second headmaster hurried forward, sabotaged the man's neck, and buried the pain as best he could, muttering, Sith, blaming and cursing. However, he ducked, dodged, and blasted the second headmaster's blade, as it came within millimeters of his neck. Hearing the thud of the ground behind him, the second headmaster jumped sideways to avoid it, but landing sent a sharp pain up his left knee. The man landed in a crouch and, with enhanced speed, shot to his feet in a spin, punching forward with his left hand and reaching behind with his right. No, no, no. He thought fiercely as his knee collapsed. Not right now. He tried to move and correct himself, but a black blur was already getting closer to his head as he dropped. With an unpleasant thump of metal against his skull, the man dropped. The white-haired man looked suspiciously at Madar, who lowered his electro staff and, after a moment's reflection, moved his staff to make sure he had a firm grip, then poked him roughly in the hollow between his neck and right shoulder, where he seemed to be unconscious, but had not been the first time. Nothing happened. He murmured, well, I suppose you're Safar now, and lifted his left hand to gently massage the long scar beneath his right jawline. He almost got a much more deadly addition to that scar today, and he winced a little at the slightest hint of a first-degree burn. He went around the man and knocked the metal grip farther away from where it had come loose from his outstretched hand. He was human, for one thing, and his red eyes were probably near human, though Madara vaguely remembered from biology that red was a rare allele, mutation, or something even in pure humans, so perhaps human was still on the table. The man stood out like a sore thumb on Utapau, and his white hair was strange considering his apparent age, and he certainly didn't look like he had hit mid-years for his life expectancy. Was it a strong force presence that made him appear younger than his age without changing his hair, or was it just another unusual color? Because of Chris Force Prowse. He was in danger, but not in the sense of a primed grenade or an imminent threat, but rather as the bright, sharp gleam of light reflected off a sword with a sheath for when it wasn't needed, and he shone bright in the Force, now that the disturbance around him had quieted down, and the knock to the head had apparently broken his shields. Why are you here at all? As he looked at the dark brown boots, the utility belt, and the two beige tunics, he said aloud, I'll bet my ship you weren't here before to that power outage. Well made and sufficiently weathered to suggest continual usage without being overdone, the boots were a superb alternative for comfort and security, in case you ever had to, for example, fight on a dry landscape. They wouldn't be something you would buy if you were low on funds. Madara kind of wanted a black pair for himself when one of his existing pairs went out. If the man's loss of balance wasn't due to the boots, the redness should have been recent, even though there were no burns or rips in the clothing that would have suggested an accident or blaster fire, and the only redness was some spotting in the upper center of the left part of his back, peeping through two layers of heavy-looking tunics. Madara groaned and replaced the staff in its magnetic clip on his back after glaring and massaging the back of his skull. Then he walked confidently forward, knelt next to the man, and removed the outer tunic, while removing a utility knife from his boots. "Sucks to be you, asshole," he said, slicing through the back of the collar and pulling the knife down. Madara flung open the tunic, swore violently, and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket for the communication device. "Mistakes," he called, looking at the big blotches of blood that were leaking through the inner tunic. "Get on the home database and find me somewhere nearby that knows how to treat probable humans beyond throwing Bacto on it and praying for the best," he said. "And get the ship over here now while you're at it." He heard a shocking series of beeps over the rolling metal, and Madara thought about how dangerous it would be to pry the cloth up to see what was going on. He replied, carefully shifting his awareness between flesh and cloth to check for problems, as his hands slowly pried the fabric up. "No, I'm alright." Fortunately, nothing seemed to have dried sufficiently to stick to the fabric yet, or at least not fortunately, since it hadn't slowed down yet. "There's a large bleed somewhere on his back close to the spine. He fought so no nerve damage I think, but his knee gave out so there's something there too," he said. With his hands holding the cloth steady, he pulled the knife through, flinching at the sight once the tunic was out of the way. Long strips of damage covered the man's entire torso, some overlapping at the top left to leave his shoulder almost entirely raw or blackened, but the rest of his back seemed cauterized, with the base of his neck, where the spine protruded outward, cracked open in the middle of the burn, along with several other areas that were bleeding freely. "And here are several reasons why you shouldn't have tried to kill me," he thought, taking cautious not to say it aloud for Bumbles to hear, as he would never be able to convince the robot to play nice. As the spacecraft started to power up in the background, Madara rolled his eyes at a query that seemed uninteresting. "No, I didn't fight him, I didn't cause the wounds, and we're not just leaving him here. He has burns on at least half of his back, and he doesn't know where else. It's more difficult to gain answers from deceased guys, and I want answers. However, I believe he will require an immersion in a Bacta tank. They are very expensive to put up. Is there one on Earth at all, Utapau?" When we could reach as he strode up to the bike, he asked, opened the compartment, and removed the small first aid bag he kept inside. Bumbles hummed doubtfully, the spaceship buzzing in the distance. "Great," he muttered, scowling as he hit the ground, setting the gear aside and tearing up a Bacta patch. He grasped a piece of sterile gauze after gritting his teeth at the sight of the excess blood accumulating around the wound. Madara ruthlessly disregarded the man's reflexive jerk as he applied the Bacta patch over the spinal wound, stating, "Sucks to be you, buddy," and smearing the blood off. The burns were too large to do much, but triage at this point, so the man would only have to deal with the glue laying on them. Rinse and repeat cleaned the other open wounds on his back, leaving him fresh out of Bacta in the kit. It was not surprising, given how much the skin flexes there during movement, that just the knee had blood on the adjoining cloth when he examined the remainder of the man. It would have exploded if he had also been burned there. He snatched some rubber tubing from the kit and, at least, had a tourniquet on the man's upper thigh. Instead of nailing him like the walking target he felt like, they would have been able to move him elsewhere before he fainted from shock or blood loss, if the force had been with them. Unfortunately, there was hardly any surface water on this awful rock, which would have been useful. Madara put the cloth back over the man's back to shield him from the chilly elements, while frowning at his bloody hands. The sterilizing wipes were the only thing available and were best left for later, but he really wanted to run one through his hair. He asked, "Do you have anything?" The robot requested for more details after giving a positive response. "We're low on options, so no, I don't care if they're underground or unregistered, if a clansman marked them reliable. We don't have enough Bacta on board to do much, and I don't think we should dare to take too long, in case there's a complication I'm missing, he's too aware. Trying to scan deeper might wake him up, which is not in the cards for several reasons. Yeah, just park nearby, I'll hover both him and the bike in, and you can steer us there. I'll stay back with him since we don't have a good place to both keep him flat and secured in case of turbulence. See you in 5. Since they were unlikely to return anytime soon and Upau's hyperwinds would destroy any evidence the first time they entered, Madara immediately levered himself up and started using the Sharingan to do a thorough scan of the area. Even though it was much fainter than when he'd first stopped and gotten off, the force itself was still rolling and bubbling like storm clouds in the circular area with more powdered dirt, where he'd originally seen the white-haired man. Even while there were thick streaks of residual dark force across the area, suggesting that multiple high-level users with scores to settle had engaged in a knockdown, drag-out fight, there was no sign that anyone other than his attacker had been present. Hell, there weren't even any footprints to indicate how the other man got to this circle's outer edge. The most peculiar thing of all is that, despite being trained and alive past your majority, you are blazing in the light side of the force, with no traces of darkness at all. How on earth were you able to accomplish that? The man was glared down at by Madara, who said, "There aren't impact marks, so you didn't fall," adding, "You weren't dropped out of a speeder. You have wounds that didn't damage your clothes, but nothing to suggest you put them on after the injury." He glared further, walked away, and carefully picked up the man's weapon where he had dropped it. It worked. It left burns of proximity. It had a slight thrum in the force, but it shouldn't have been possible. It was definitely real. It nearly took his head off, but it couldn't be. How is it possible for someone to possess a lightsaber?